All right, welcome to this week's webinar. Today we have our education manager, Nick Abbott, with us. He has a ton of interesting tools and workflows he'll be sharing with us today as we take a look at an architectural viz scene that he put together for this webinar. As I mentioned, Nick is our education manager, which takes him to design schools across the U.S., so he might be visiting a school near you at some point. He is a seasoned industrial designer himself, and previous to his time here at KeyShot, he also co-taught a design course at ASU. At KeyShot, he not only helps design programs get set up and running with the latest EDU software, but he also manages our student ambassador program. I'm sure he'll talk a bit more about that on his end, so I'll leave that for him. As usual, a little housekeeping before we get started. If you've been a part of our webinars before, I'm sure you've heard me mention our KeyShot Luminaries community. It's a great forum for KeyShot users to connect across the globe, share ideas and feedback, and even practice your skills with our regularly posted challenges. It's also a great place to keep up to date with our new releases and also to participate in betas. And quickly, before I pass it over to Nick, I wanted to plug our KeyShot 3D YouTube channel. We regularly post quick tips and tutorials on our channel, as well as our webinars after airing live. You'll find this webinar up on our channel by early next week. So if you missed anything or you want to come back to something that Nick covered, keep an eye out for that. We've also introduced a new series on our YouTube channel called KeyShot Pro Tips, where we feature learning content created by designers and visualizers throughout the industry. So if you are a KeyShot user or a content creator and you'd like to share some of that knowledge with the rest of the KeyShot community, reach out to us through Luminaries. And on that note, let's get this thing moving. Nick, feel free to kick things off whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you for the wonderful intro, Kareem. Yeah, so my name is Nick. As Kareem mentioned, a good chunk of my job is to travel to universities. So if you are a professor seeing this and you're interested in arranging something, or if you're a student interested in our upcoming ambassador program expansion, always feel free to just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Would be happy to connect. But yeah, let's just go ahead and get into this scene. So this is what we're going to be covering today. As Kareem touched on, this is an interior ArchViz scene. We'll be covering a wide range of things, including typical processes such as applying materials and setting up lighting. But on top of that, we'll be covering unexpected sort of hurdles that users might have to deal with as they navigate from sort of a scene from scratch to finish. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. So I've got our scene right here, and this might be how you import your environment, right? And right off the bat, something is odd, and if you don't know what's going on, you'll soon find out because basically our environment is too small. And you can see right here, this is sort of what we're typically used to in KeyShot. But to ameliorate this problem, all we need to do is go into our environment tab and go into the size and just change this to like 5,000. Okay, so this is more familiar with sort of a standard, KeyShot import. Basically, if you hadn't done that, you would have found out that that was problematic because if you tried to sort of, move something around, it just wouldn't move at all. So you would have quickly realized. But once again, we're just increasing the size of our environment. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's take a quick look at our scene here. You can see some things have materials applied, some things don't, and we even have this weird sort of black material, which is definitely indicative of something strange happening. We'll talk about how to deal with that in a second. But yeah, let's just talk about the scene. So this scene, we will be setting this up very specifically for a camera angle like this. A lot of times this is just sort of how renders are made with sort of one angle in mind. You could certainly get other angles that are similar like this maybe. But we are just going to first start by creating that camera. So I'll go up into my camera tab and just drop down these menus in case they're collapsed. And let's just go ahead and click on our middle mouse wheel to pan and just find sort of an angle that looks nice. One thing I want to do is ensure that I'm looking straight down this sort of room, and I'll just ensure that by typing in -180 here. I could scroll my middle mouse wheel to zoom in, but first thing we'll notice when we do that is we're sort of getting a huge, jump from where the border is here to here. And basically, to fix that, all you need to do is tweak your distance in the slider right here. And this will just help you be a little bit more nuanced with how you move your camera. Okay, so we haven't created a camera yet. If I were to move around, basically this progress would be lost. All we need to do is click on this button right here. And then we've created our camera. So now if I were to move around, I could jump back into that camera. By default, KeyShot has a value of 50, and I almost always change this fairly significantly. But for this scene, it actually works pretty good. Let's just tweak this slightly to 48. Honestly, probably won't make a huge difference. Oh, and okay, so we have our camera set up. Let's now, and one theme about this sort of tutorial is that we're just going to be jumping around. There's tons of stuff to cover in this tutorial, and we're just going to do as much as we can. Okay, so we've set up our camera, and I'm going to switch over to my free camera so that I can move around. Let's talk about the overall scene again. We've adjusted the overall environment size. If you ever want to evaluate sort of your KeyShot scale, what you can do is go into our cloud library, which tends to sort of be overlooked down here. You can go in there and then log in. And then if you go into the models tab, you type in human, you can download a dummy human right here. And this is really useful because you can see I already have one in here. You could just simply drag it in, and it might take a second to load. We'll have this very useful sort of preview icon, and in a little bit lighter of a scene, you can pretty interactively move that around to just place something really conveniently. But you can see after it loads for a second, we have our human dummy. And you can see right off the bat, this room is definitely larger, than your average room. Certainly bigger than my place I currently live at. But this is nice. It's sort of, a lofted, luxurious, setup that we're going for anyway. So the scale is close enough. Works for us. Nothing crazy is going on. Okay, so I'm gonna delete that. And let's just go into our environment tab. Currently, by default, KeyShot gives us this studio environment. Let's set up a quick lighting environment. Basically, we'll do lighting twice in this tutorial. We're going to do this sort of quick lighting, and then we can go back in and create a manual lighting situation. Just to show some variance. So we have our HDRI, just drag this in. You could rotate this around with by holding control and left clicking, so much quicker than the manual way, which is to go into the environment tab and just rotating this like this. If there's one hotkey I use more than anything, it's probably this action right here. You could always hit K on your keyboard to bring up the hotkeys. But I'm just going to navigate my light so it's sort of coming in from these arches. I kind of want the sun to be a little bit lower in the sky. So I can go into my HDRI editor and then go into transform and then go to tilt. And you can see the shadows are going to get a little longer in our room. Okay, this works out. Maybe we increase the brightness in our HDRI. Maybe we drop down the saturation so we don't have, if I go back to 100, or actually default is 50, you can see we're getting the blues from the sky. Not a big fan of that. Let's just do like 10. Okay, so we have some lighting going on just from the HDRI. Let's set up some other settings. Let's go into our lighting tab and make sure we click on interior. And right off the bat, you can see the scene gets a little bit lighter. And one thing to note, I'm also in GPU mode, which is going to help us out a lot in this scene. So if I switch between basic and interior, you can see how much more well lit the scene is, and that's basically the light just being able to bounce around more. Another thing that's going to dramatically improve the aesthetics of our scene is utilizing our image tab. So if we go into photographic, we can drop down this tone mapping. Let's just add a little bit of exposure. So right off the bat, even more light coming on into the scene, and that's actually sort of artificial. It's effectively like a filter. And one misconception is maybe in order to increase the brightness of a scene, you think, oh, I need to blast the scene with more light. You could just sort of do that over here in this filter. Maybe we add a little bit of contrast, 0.2, something like that. You could also cycle between our options for image transform. I'm actually going to go with the low contrast. We have a high contrast, and this was sort of switched back and forth when I was working out the scene. And we'll talk more about that as we go. And yeah, we'll come back to this. There's a lot of people always ask, do you do lighting first, materials first? And it's kind of, for me personally, it's always just the back and forth. And that's kind of what we're going to get at with this tutorial. Okay, so let's start applying some materials, and then we'll add our manual lighting and continue from there. So we already have this material pre-applied. I want to copy it over to here and here, actually. One quick way to do that is to hold Shift and left click. And with Shift still selected, I can right click. And that's a quick copy and paste. You could also double click into your material and then drag the material preview up here onto your object. Okay, so let's continue on applying things. Let's apply material to the floor right here. What we're going to do with the floor first is go into our tools and go to unwrap UV. And this is going to be a simple process because our object is flat. And we're just going to simply click unwrap, hit apply. And so now our floor is unwrapped. And I'll explain why we are doing that in a second, but let's just double click into our floor, go into material graph. And I'm just going to drag in some image textures right here. Okay, there we go. When it comes to applying these textures, usually I apply what's most obvious, and most of the time that is the color. Often it'll be called base color, sometimes just color or albedo. You'll need to refer to the file name to get used to that, because a lot of these image textures are black and white, so they can be hard to discern. But this one's pretty obvious. It looks just like the texture. So let's go ahead and plug that into base color and go into our mapping type and change this to UV. All right, so the scale is definitely a little large here. Let's go to scene units. Actually, we'll stay into the UV, and let's just drop this down to maybe 0.5. Maybe we'll do like 0.4 or 0.35. That looks fine. Okay. So let's now plug in our roughness. You can notice, first of all, that our material was selected as a generic material type. This works for plastic, advanced, generic. All these material types work pretty well, so interchangeably. So let's just use our roughness map. And you could plug it into this empty slot right here, or quicker than that is just to drag it into the empty slot. So let's do that and ensure that our scale is the same and the mapping type, and it is. Sometimes it doesn't always sync, but looks like it's doing a good job at that. Let's now plug in our bump and double clicking to ensure the scale is proper there. Okay. Great. Now let's apply our displacement map. And so bump maps, if you are unfamiliar, they create the illusion of a raised or lowered surface. But what if we actually want to raise or lower the surface of a geometry? What we want to do is utilize what's known as a height map, also known as a displacement map. This is black and white, and will actually change the surface of the object. So you can't just plug this in over here. What you need to do is right click and go into geometry displace. And I always right click empty things to empty spaces to navigate this. You could also hit space. This is sort of a newer way of finding nodes, and it's just more visual. You could just drag something like that into the material graph right here. But I'm gonna hit space again, get rid of that, and just plug my displacement into displace, and then plug that into the geometry of the root node. Okay, so what I need to do first, though, is ensure that my displacement is set to the same scale and mapping type as my other textures. And this is why we UV unwrapped our floor, because I could simply go into UV and then change this to, what was this, 0.35. Let me double check that. Yes. Okay, so the scale is now the same. But what we want to do is tweak our UV or our displacement settings. So the height is fine for this. We what we want to do is change the triangle size to a smaller size. This will increase the resolution of the texture as well as increase the max triangles. Nothing will happen until you hit execute geometry. So let's do that. And it'll just take a few seconds to load. Quicker with a better GPU, better hardware in your computer. But yeah, you could always expect there to be some sort of lag in between this kind of process, no matter if you've got like a supercomputer. Okay, so you can see it actually raised the geometry. It's actually protruding into our rug. So let's deal with that. Let's select our floor, go into position, move tool, and you can see it's kind of hard to navigate because we need to actually zoom out. The gizmo is by default like in the middle of the object. So let's just move this down. And what you could do is take advantage of this box over here to finally move things. So you can see it's obviously been moved too much, but while I'm back in the camera, I can tweak that by typing in values in this box to sort of see what's going on. So it looks like negative 2.5 should work. Negative 2.75. Yeah. Okay. And you could definitely tweak that with this gizmo as well. I'm just going to leave that. We've got a little gap. That's fine. We'll just keep on going on. What? That's going to bother me. I'm going to move this up a little bit. Okay. Yeah. We'll come back and fix this. But in the meantime, what I actually want to do is tweak the color a little bit. And this is common for most textures. When I'm bringing in what's known as a PBR texture, all of these image textures. And what I want to do is right click, and I'll zoom in a little bit for you. Right click this line, go to utilities and color adjust. And this is a very useful node for adjusting colors for everything. And what I'm going to do here is drop down the saturation a little bit. You'll see the image is going to be a little less colorful. But more importantly, I'm going to make it brighter. And so you can see it's starting to look more, I don't know, more aligned to something that you might actually have in your coastal, room. And also, I'm going to bring down the contrast. And so now we're getting this sort of more of a muted texture. So this node is great. It'll give you tons of flexibility in working with textures you might find online. Okay, so we've created that. Let's just actually address this glaring issue right here. And this is really just a consequence of your model coming from sort of software that maybe you didn't package the materials properly, right? And I could have fixed this, but it's good to talk about. Basically, all we need to do is you can see if I try to change the color, nothing happens. And that's because if we had to go into our material graph to understand that we actually have these textures that just, aren't loading anything. So all we need to do is delete those. And now we are back to a familiar sort of starting point where you could just change this to whatever material you want. You want a red plastic couch, go for it. Yeah. And so we'll just go ahead and tweak this object in the back also. And one thing I could do, I could just try to navigate to it, but it's kind of hard. Our camera is a little bit wobbly. We're not centered around this. Easy thing to do there is to just right click and go to center and fit selection. And so this will just help me jump right to the object. So once again, if I wanted to do that, right click, center and fit selection. And so now I could just delete these, unlinked materials, do the same for this and this right here. I'm not sure how many surfaces come with this model. Okay, it looks fine. I think there's something else inside that has the same situation, but we'll just keep going on. While we're on the shelf area, one thing to note um, is that I've organized this a little bit. And just to back it up even further, let's say your interface looks a little bit different. Simply just go up here and go to default, and this will get you back to the interface we're working with. So maybe this is what you are experiencing. You can't find your toolbar. Just go up here, go to default, and you are able to sort of navigate this tutorial in the same way I am. Okay, so the reason I thought of that is because we're going to talk about model sets and organizing your scene. And the interface is currently, I believe, defaulted to hide model sets, and you have to actually click on this button right here to find those. And you can see I already have a few set up, and one of which is a shelf. And this is basically a way to organize your scene. So you can see if I hide this, you'll have to give it a second. It'll hide. I've basically just put all those objects into a nice convenient little folder. These model sets, you can think of them like that. Basically just helps you, instead of having to try and find groups in your scene tree, you can just have them conveniently placed over here. But you can see if I were to hide this again, we don't have this object in there. And I've left that out because I want to show you how to add objects to a model set or even create one. So you just have to click on your object in the scene tree, and you could right click and go to create model set from selection. But since we already have one, I'm going to copy to model set and then select shelf. I'm gonna hit continue. And now if I hide this, you'll still see the lamp, and that's because we copied it. So let's just delete the old one, and we can confirm that it's still in the tree right here. So let's just delete that. It has two parts, delete both of them. And so this is one thing I would take advantage of when you're working with a sort of complex scene like this, is to organize your scene. Okay, let's now create our backdrop. What I'm going to do here is go to edit, add geometry, and then add a plane. And once again, adding geometry or displacements are always going to take a few seconds for KeyShot to just think and load things. It has to process various things. And so this is loading. It'll pop up in a second here. It should just be right underneath our scene in the middle. Okay, great. Let's just move this with this gizmo right here and rotate with shift. Let's move this over here. And I actually want to scale this up, but you can see our gizmo doesn't include a scaling option. That's because it's unselected right here. We can just simply select that. And now we have this orange box that we can scale uniformly. We can also scale things just by typing in the value in our scale box right here under the position tab. Maybe we type in like 2000, something like that. Okay, that looks good. Let's move our plane to something like this. We're basically going to create a fake backdrop. All right. Now I can double click this and go into the setting to make this an emissive material. What I'm going to do next is go into material graph and then simply drag in an image I've already prepared. This will serve as our background. I'm going to plug this into the color, and it'll give it a second. We need to double click on the image texture, change the rotation, go to move texture, and just drag this with shift. Looks good. Let's double click into our emissive material and just make this a little bit brighter. All right, let's go into our camera to see how this looks. Okay, so definitely needs some tweaking. Let me get rid of this. And I have my plane right here. Let's just make this like 3,000. Okay, that looks good. Now let's double click into our plane in the back. Go into the material graph, click on the image texture, and let's go uncheck repeat. This is just going to help us understand where our image is placed. You can see we have a repeated texture out here, but if we undo that, we can know exactly where the border of our image is. So now we can just simply move this like this, and I'm going to pay attention to where the sort of the horizon line is, and I think it should be around here. It just looks like it's not big enough, so let's scale that up. And something like that could work pretty well. Um, let's hit check. And let's go into our material graph and tweak something. Let's once again utilize color adjust. And let's tweak the saturation to maybe 0.8, just to bring it down a bit. This is definitely something you can creatively take control over. You could try to mimic uh, what happens with photography, where the sort of the outside is more bright than the inside, or you could just um, sort of have everything exposed as if you took the photo with like like an iPhone or something. They're pretty good at doing that. Let's just keep the settings here. We could always come back. Okay, so scenes coming together. Let's now shift our focus into um, creating creating a manual lighting environment. Let me just, we're not going to populate everything with materials. We'll sort of jump to a more finished scene to talk about other things. But this gray wall is sort of bothering me. What I could do is just make this a very basic color. You could sort of see we've got this tan theme going on. So one thing I sort of do before I bring in image textures is just sort of color block things with plastics and get a rough idea of the sort of CMF of the scene. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a spotlight. So we're going to go to edit, add light, spotlight. And you can see it popped up down here. I can move this in a few ways. I'd like to introduce people to the geometry view, which we're going to utilize. And so to position things while still looking at through the camera, this is sort of the best way of doing that. What we're going to do is exit out of that, click on geometry view right here, and then dock it up on the left. All right. And if you ever had the problem of not being able to sort of like scale these windows, it might just be locked for you. All you need to go to image and ensure that lock resolution isn't checked. If it is, I'm not going to be able to scale these things, but if it's unchecked, then I can always, kind of hard to select here. Then I could, there you go, rearrange the scale of these. And that could be a frustrating thing to deal with if you're unaware of what's going on there. Okay, so coming back to the geometry view, quick recap. This is a great tool for moving things around while also staying in your scene. So what I want to do is actually bring down my image brightness. Let's do like 0.1, just so that we can focus on our spotlight. So now we're really just seeing the emissive light in the back. So let's go into our scene tab, click on our spotlight. It's already selected. Come up here for the move tool. And let's move the spotlight. So you can see right away, spotlight is facing downward. Let's go ahead and rotate this. Like that. Now, if I move this over here, we can see it's sort of facing to the side. Let's give this a little bit of a rotation like that. And let's move the spotlight sort of outside the scene. Let's move this sort of exactly in the middle, because what I could do is, with that selected, let's go ahead and hit OK and go back to the move tool. Let's click on our pivot object. And this is, once again, with the move tool selected, we can click on an object in our scene, whether it's in this viewport or this viewport. We can hit OK. And then we are able to rotate an object around other objects. And I use this mostly for lights, but you could also do this for animations. If you have like a robotic arm you want to animate, this is something you could do. So this allows me to rotate my light to sort of help me position this appropriately. Okay, I'm gonna hit OK. And then I'm gonna hit this button right here to release that pivot. And now it's back on the object. Let's click into our spotlight and adjust some settings here. Let's crank this brightness way up. You can see really nothing is happening here. Maybe we get rid of one of those zeros. Okay, that's looking better. Still a little bit bright. We'll tweak that. One thing that's really powerful with the spotlight is that you are able to control this radius value. And you could see, if I do that, take note of the edge of the shadow here. And this is why we're actually going to go with the spotlight, because it's rather future proof. You can control the edge fall off basically of the shadow. So right now it's super crisp. Let's go ahead and soften that up a little bit. You can see now we have a little bit of a softer edge. If you type in a higher value, it's even softer. Let's go with 200, and now you could almost not even tell that there is sort of a shadow edge. So it's up to you what value you want to do here. We'll just do like 30. Okay, so let's rotate our spotlight just a little bit. I actually want sort of the shadow of this plant to be on this couch. So what I want to do is bring the spotlight downward. And we are currently in local axis. Let's go to global. And this will basically switch the direction of how we move our object to orient itself to the overall environment, and not just the axes associated with the object. Okay, so by doing this, I'm actually creating a longer shadow because now the light source is coming at more of a grazing angle. And so you can see now we have this nice sort of shadow on the couch. And that's just a subtle, art directed thing you could do. I also want to rotate this so that it encompasses more of the scene. And you could also adjust the beam angle of your spotlight. So maybe we want to make it wider right here. And this will basically just illuminate more things in the scene. Let's move this back a little bit. So maybe we move this like something like here. And let's go back into the brightness and change that to, I don't know, something like 2 maybe. Definitely takes some tweaking, but this is sort of how I would go about lighting this scene. I won't spend too much time just arranging this light. But yeah, we'll just keep on going on. One thing I want to do is hop back into my image tab right here, and let's just tweak some image styles. So let's go into the white balance. One thing that's really nice for this scene is dropping this down. And so this is something I don't often use, but you can see if I go all the way down, we're actually making the scene globally warm. All the way in the inverse direction, we're making it cool. And so one thing that works really well for this is we can make everything a little bit warmer. And we can also go down into the color and sort of increase vibrance for textures like that as well. And when working with these interior scenes, it really just is all of these materials coming together to sort of give you the effect of realism. But yeah, so don't get discouraged if you're doing this and it's not looking super great. You basically just keep adding materials and it'll compound. Sort of like sketching, right? It's like your first few lines might not look great, but if you keep going and keep up with it, it'll look good in the end. Okay, so let's just jump around a little bit. Let's go and talk about the outside of the scene. One thing I could do also is go into my HDRI editor, and what we did earlier was we just made the brightness 0.1. Let's go ahead and actually go into our default environment. Let's just drag in. Actually, we won't do that. Let's tweak the HDRI editor. Let's just go into solid color and then add an HDRI pin. And we can move out of our scene. You can see now we've got an all gray environment. Let's go into our environment tab and just click. You can see we're creating a light in the back. Let's target this scene in the sort of the same direction as our spotlight. Okay, and we are doing this because this will allow us to create extra light in our scene that isn't just the spotlight. It'll sort of help fill the scene. So if I open that up, let me reposition that. We could also increase the color of our background. And I am being tripped up right now because I forgot to change the brightness of our scene. So let's go to 1. You can see I was trying to change the color of our background environment, but it wasn't matching up. And that was because our overall settings for brightness was at 0.1. So just keep that in mind. Let's just do something like this. And come back here to sort of find that angle of the HDRI pin that you want to add to your scene. So I'm just going to click on this wall so that the light is basically behind, and I could even move that over here, something like that. I usually don't look at the environment lighting in the settings. I'll usually just change it to a solid color, but in this instance, it actually helped us out. Okay, so that definitely brought more light into the environment. If I just change the brightness to 0, you can see this is all of the spotlight light, but if we now include a little bit of the light in the HDRI, as well as that 1 pin, we're starting to get a nice lighting effect. Okay, so we've got a lovely pool area sort of on the side here. Let's give it some water. What we could do is go to Edit, Add Geometry Plane, and then move that over. And we want to scale this again. And once again, this is unselected. I just need to, instead of scaling this uniformly, I want to scale this just on one axis. And in order to do that, you can just click on this. It's a little hard to see because we have like a blue on blue going on right here. But there's an axis right here that you can just scale things in that direction only. So you could see if I scale that even further, let's just basically match the pool, move this up, scale it a little, well, not that. Okay, that works. It's definitely intersecting with the geometry around it, but that actually is what we want. Okay, so let's now make it water. I could double click and go into our materials. We have a liquids tab, and let's just go ahead and drop the liquid water ripples displace onto our plane. Let's go ahead and click no there and give it a second. Once again, displacement, adding geometry, always going to take a few seconds. So once this is done, you're going to see that we're going to be able to quickly recreate water that isn't so still. A pool, obviously more realistic if it's just flat, if no one's in there, but it's definitely going to look more aesthetic like this. So I would encourage people to do that. Okay, so let's increase the visibility of our water to make it look like water. First thing we want to do there is actually apply material underneath. So in order to give this pool sort of a tile material, first we need to separate the geometry. Currently, it's all just one part. If we go to Tools, split object surfaces, we can now select with control all of these walls and then hit split surface, apply. Now we're able to have this separated out. So if I double click in, go to material graph, you can see it's inherited the material from the other object. Let's go ahead and right click and unlink that first, because if we don't do that and we delete the old texture, then it would delete the surrounding material as well. So now we have a starting point. Let's just go ahead and simply drag in a few image textures here. And we've got our color, roughness, and bump. So let's just go ahead and do that. Drag that into color. And this might take a second to load here. There we go. We're under box map, which works perfectly actually. So let's just make this smaller. Let's go to 1000. Still a little big, but we'll keep it at the clean 1000 size. Let's go ahead and plug in our bump as well as our roughness, and ensure that they've inherited the same size. Okay, that looks good. So now let's go ahead and go back into our scene and re-show that plane that we created with the water. So once we do that, you're going to see it sort of popping out on the sides, but not a whole lot has changed with the visibility of the water. That's partially due to the lighting. If I were to evaluate the lighting, one thing that's great in KeyShot is you're constantly able to create multiples of things, multiple materials, lighting, environments. And so what we're going to do here is just create a quick new lighting environment so that I could show how lighting might affect the water. And then I'm going to show sort of how you would actually change the visibility of this water. So if I just dragged in an HDRI, I actually didn't need to make that other one. I'll delete that. You can see now we're able to see the water better, and that still doesn't really make it look more like water. We're not able to see into the pool. And really the source of this problem is in our lighting tab. We need to make sure caustics is selected. And once we do that, we're going to be able to see the water look, like water. If I were to go into the water, we're even able to start to see what caustics are most familiar doing, which is sort of that light dance at the bottom of your pool, basically a consequence of light going through multiple mediums. And it's not super obvious here, and that's because let me go and create another environment. Go into the HDRI editor. Let's make this like pretty dark. Let's recreate the sun really quick. So let's make this like a 0.5 radius and just bump up the intensity. So now that we have a small bright light source, this is going to, let me make this even smaller and maybe a little bit less bright. Now this is going to interact with the sort of surface geometry on the top of the water we created, and this is going to be what caustics are most familiar with for most of us at least. And but that's because we have, once again, a small bright light source, which is sort of required for showing this effect. We don't really even need to show the water accurately, and so I'm actually going to just delete these two environments and go back to our original one, and actually undo caustics, because this is fairly taxing on the computer. And you can see if I go back into our camera, we really can't even see the water that well. Let's actually raise it up just to see it a little bit better. But it's going to pick up on the reflection here, and it's going to be hard to tell if you even are able to see it properly. So it's not really worth it to initiate that. Okay, so we're almost done with this scene. Basically, everything else is just a consequence, or is just you needing to apply materials. You can see things that just still don't have materials properly applied. But one thing I want to talk about is sort of applying sort of smudges to things. So let's go into this material right here. and go back into our camera. And before we get into that, actually, I'm looking at the time here. We'll not get into that. What I want to talk about is sort of one last thing you might need to understand if you're adding plants. So let me switch over to sort of a finished scene. And I have that pulled up right here. Let's see, where is it? Okay, so things look pretty much the same. Definitely more care is done with with just placing things, and that's uh, that just takes time. Definitely not useful in a live video format. But I've added this plant here, and I want to talk about that briefly. So once again, we're in our image tab. We can see that we've added some exposure, just like we did in the previous scene, and this is actually not the finished one. The finished one has that warm slider. It also has some color. I also tweaked in the curve section. I dropped down the highlights here. You can see if I go to 0, it's just a subtle effect in the highlights. But what I want to talk about is this plant. And I actually have one more scene I want to talk about regarding the plant. So you might download a plant and bring it into KeyShot and not be super thrilled at it. And it's definitely not KeyShot's fault or the plant's, just some settings. And to recoup what is going on with the plant, it'll come with an opacity texture, which if you bring in a plant and you see it look like this, I wouldn't immediately go run for a refund. You just need to plug in your opacity texture that comes with the plant into the opacity channel. And yeah, that's weird. Um, Another thing, okay, so I think it's just still loading. Strange. Okay, yeah, things happen in live demos. But what I wanted to address here is if I go back into my finished scene, and once again, I can click into my object, go into material graph. You can see the same thing was applied into the opacity channel. So I don't know what was going on with the other scene. But what's important here is it still doesn't look super great. And one thing I want to take note of is you need to go into your lighting section and then just change the ray bounces. I think by default it's like 12 or 16. We need to crank this way up. And you can see now if I hit Control Shift R to sort of navigate to a render region, we can see that our plant is looking more like a plant, nice and fluffy and bright. And it's sort of doesn't have those weird shadow areas. I'll change this back to like 20 to see the difference. Basically, the light just didn't have enough. Uh, there wasn't enough room for the light to bounce around a lot, and so this will help with that. Okay, I don't want to go too long on this scene. I know we jumped around a bit. I think this is a good time to bring up some questions.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Nick. That was pretty awesome. We covered quite a bit there. I did want to comment on a couple things. I noticed that you were in the material graph quite a bit. If there's any students watching or if you're new users, I know the material graph can get a little overwhelming at times. Honestly, don't let it. Just kind of jump in there and start playing around. Because I mean, you saw what Nick was able to create by playing in there. It really expands the capabilities that you have in KeyShot. And at first, with all those nodes and lines and stuff, it is definitely intimidating. Play with it for a little bit, you're going to realize that it's pretty easy to deal with. So that's a big thing, and I'm glad you were kind of in there for a portion of the time. I also noticed you were on GPU. Quick comment on my end: if you are going to use GPU, which I do recommend you do, it has saved me many times. Try to work in GPU because we're getting closer and closer to parity between GPU and CPU, but there's always a little bit of a discrepancy. So if you're going to render in GPU, work in GPU. If you're going to render in CPU, work in CPU. That's just my recommendation. And I'm also excuse me, really glad you touched on model sets. So like in this scene specifically, since it's ArcViz, you got a lot of different details and materials and products in here. So being able to organize using those model sets is great. But if you're coming from like a product perspective and you're rendering, this season's release on something, there's a bunch of different variations, or you have something that's really modular, it's a great way to show off those product variations and different configurations. So that's really, really nice. And then lastly, that background. I'm really stoked that you were actually putting that background together and using the emissive. That's what I do pretty much all the time. I know, you have the built-in HDRIs and you have these kind of fake planes. That's also a great way to make different displays. So if you're like rendering a phone or you have some sort of display in the background, that's a great way to kind of show that off. But on that subject, why use a plane as a backplate with an image on it rather than just using the HDRI environment?
Yeah, thanks for all that, Kareem. I think it all comes down to more control. Like we use the spotlight so that first of all it gave us the ability to tweak the softness of the shadow. Being able to maneuver this plane in the back is super useful, as well as, for example, so one thing I did is I made the whole scene really warm, right? What if I bring that even more down, and then the background starts to change color? What we could do is sort of compensate for that by tweaking the sort of hue and saturation of our background. So you could sort of make it more blue and more saturated, to sort of accommodate and bring back the coolness of the background while also changing sort of the warmth of the entire scene. And so I talked about, you know, the difference between local and global settings. That's definitely one thing I would take note of. You could choose to globally change something. So let's say we globally increase the contrast, and that's changing everything, right? We see everything being more full of contrast. This definitely doesn't look good. But let's do the opposite, right? Let's do negative 0.3. Let's make this even less full of contrast. What we could do now is sort of, if we want to, choose to locally bring back contrast. So if I were to go into this material, maybe I go to material graph, I could go into the color adjust node, which is already set up. And now instead of this value, maybe I increase the contrast. So now you could see I'm bringing back the contrast in just this object. And that could be really powerful for you to sort of change everything. And then maybe you want to just tweak a few things separately. And you could do it like that. Also, I forgot to talk about the smudges in the other scene. I'll cover that really quickly here. This is our material. Basically, so let me plug in the roughness. Oh. So we have a really shiny floor. Let's just give it some smudges really quick. I brought in this image texture right here, and let's go ahead and right click, go to color composite. And this is going to combine this image texture with our roughness. And so let's just plug this into the source, into the roughness, nothing changes. But now let's plug in the other image texture into the background and double click and go into overlay. Usually I pick multiply, but in this instance, overlay works really well. And so now you could see we have this image effect going on, and this is basically just needs to be tweaked with size. Let me just bring this up to like 400. Looks like we got a lot of repeated texture. So now if I hop out of that, we have some really subtle smudges on the floor, and that will just go a long ways in creating more realism. Yeah.
Sweet, thank you. And on a side note, that little kind of preview you were seeing of the smudges on that surface right there, he's using color preview mode. So if you're inside the material graph and you want to kind of tweak the way something looks, maybe you can do it right now real quick.
Yeah.
If you hit the hotkey C, it isolates that specific node, and then you can see that image superimposed on top of your surface. So it just makes it a little bit easier to control the image itself rather than the end effect, because sometimes it gets lost depending on the angle you're at or the lighting. So it's a really useful tool. And I mean, I've seen you use it a few times through this presentation, and I use it all the time too. So little trick that's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cream. I'll go back on my statement earlier about my rotation hotkey for the environment being my most used hotkey. I would definitely, I'll say C on the keyboard for this to be actually the most used hotkey.
Probably for me too. And
Yeah.
also, a side note, we were talking about that background image and using the emissives. A really fun thing that you can do when you're using an actual background image rather than the HDRI environment is, like, let's say you need to render something in context. You have a product that needs to be in context. You have a space inside your apartment or your office that you want to show this thing in. Like, you can literally just take a photo of it and then throw it in there and do the same thing. So you can give a real world context to a location that, you might want to render something in. Another useful trick when you're working with those background images.
Right, right. And you would just apply that to the backplate image right here. And that would just pop in the back. And you could, yeah, once again, you could recreate basically any environment if you just take some photos of it.
Super fun, lots of flexibility. Well, we don't have too much time for questions today. Hopefully we managed to answer a couple of them in the chat. And if we didn't, we'll try to get to them directly. But I think we're going to wrap it up at this point. So thank you again, Nick. Appreciate you taking the time to put this together for us. Thank you to everyone here today. As I mentioned earlier, we'll have this up on our YouTube channel early next week. Make sure to stay tuned for our upcoming webinars and new content. And we look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Got any closing comments for anyone, Nick?
Nope. Just appreciate it.
Awesome. Well,
Cheers.
thank you, everyone. You take it easy.